what if I told you that up to 15% of children experience some form of transient psychotic symptom? Like hearing a voice or maybe harboring this fleeting magical belief.
Right.
And what if I told you that your the actual sociological landscape of the neighborhood you grew up in might have just as much to do with whether that symptom solidifies into a lifelong illness as your actual DNA?
Yeah, it's a staggering thought. I mean, we've spent a century essentially operating under this assumption that severe mental illness is a biological inevitability, just, written into our genetic code.
Right, exactly.
But the data we are looking at today completely shatters that narrative. It replaces the whole idea of genetic destiny with a much more complex and, frankly, much more hopeful reality.
Absolutely. So we are taking a deep dive into the architecture of the human mind today. We're specifically focusing on Chapter 12.5 from Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry. The chapter is titled The Clinical Epidemiology of Psychosis Spectrum Disorder. And our mission today for you listening is to really build a robust mental model. We want to understand the exact mechanisms of how vulnerability, environment, and neurodevelopment interact over an entire lifetime, really, to create this spectrum of psychosis.
Yeah, and we need to anchor ourselves to the core definition of the field here. Psychiatry is fundamentally the study of how the brain, the mind, and experience interact. And, crucially, how that entire process can go wrong.
Right, and the emphasis there really has to be placed on the word interact, doesn't it?
It does, because for decades, the psychiatric approach was heavily skewed toward finding a single broken gear in the machine.
Like a single faulty gene or something.
Exactly. Single gene, a single chemical imbalance. But the reality of psychosis spectrum disorder is that there is no single point of failure. I mean, we are looking at a compounding cascade of interactions that take place over decades.
To really visualize this cascade, I want to introduce a framing device. Because I was reading this chapter and trying to map out how all these risk factors actually fit together in real time, and I kept picturing a detective. So let's call him Medlock Holmes.
I like it. A psychiatric investigator.
Right. So our detective, Medlock Holmes, steps into this vast, cavernous railway control room. It's dimly lit, but stretching out in front of him is this massive glowing board, right, displaying just thousands upon thousands of illuminated tracks.
And each track represents a single human journey, from conception all the way through to late adulthood.
Exactly. And as Holmes watches this board, he observes that some of these illuminated routes run completely smooth. The trains leave the station, maintain a steady speed, and reach their destination without a single hitch.
Right, so those would represent the individuals who navigate development without any significant psychiatric distress.
Yeah. But Holmes would also see a massive amount of turbulence on that board, wouldn't he?
He absolutely would.
Because he sees trains hitting these subtle early diversions. Maybe a train is delayed at a very early developmental milestone. Later on the journey, maybe it's diverted through a dark tunnel of severe anxiety.
Or it encounters the heavy friction of childhood trauma. Yeah.
Right. Or sometimes the train sparks with unusual perceptual experiences. Those early transient psychotic symptoms we mentioned in the intro.
Yes.
But the most fascinating part of this control room Mac is that most of those diverted trains eventually merge back onto the main smooth line. They experience turbulence and then they just sort of self-correct.
Yeah, which is the psychiatric equivalent of a transient episode. The individual experiences distress, perhaps even subclinical psychotic symptoms, but they don't transition into a persistent disorder.
Yeah.
The system essentially finds a way to regulate itself.
But then a smaller number of those tracks hit a specific sequence of switches, and these switches send the train veering further and further away from the main line, accelerating down this steep gradient toward persistent, unrelenting psychosis and, significant functional impairment.
And our detective is staring at this glowing network, knowing he cannot just look for one broken switch. He has to study the entire topology of the network.
Right. He needs to understand why two trains that start in roughly the same place, built in the exact same factory, end up on radically different trajectories.
That vast glowing map Medlock Holmes is studying is essentially the field of clinical epidemiology.
Right.
And we need to differentiate that from the epidemiology most people are familiar with. Because when the general public hears the word epidemiology, they usually picture, Jon Snow taking the handle off the Broad Street pump to stop cholera.
Yeah, or modern scientists tracking the R naught of a respiratory virus. They picture just counting the sick versus the healthy.
Exactly. But clinical epidemiology in psychiatry goes far beyond simply tabulating prevalence rates.
Yeah.
It is really the basic science of preventive medicine.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, it's the systematic study of the variation in susceptibility, the timing of onset, the longitudinal course, and the ultimate outcome within specific populations. We are interrogating the data to make predictions and, critically, to hunt for modifiable risk factors.
So it's a structural analysis. We aren't just saying, oh, this demographic has a higher rate of psychosis. We are asking what specific sequence of environmental switches this demographic hit that the control group missed, and can we actually change those switches?
Yes, precisely. And the governing rule of this entire railway network is that risk factors are cumulative. They very rarely act in total isolation.
Right.
They can be additive, where one risk factor plus a second risk factor simply doubles the overall risk.
Yeah.
But the more critical phenomenon is when they are synergistic.
Synergistic meaning they basically multiply each other, right? The combined effect is vastly greater than just the sum of their parts.
Exactly. Your individual inherited risk factors are fundamentally modified by the specific environments you pass through, by random biological events during fetal development, or even by other genetic markers. And there is a vital clinical takeaway here that often gets completely overlooked. The risk factors that govern the initial onset of a disorder are frequently entirely different from the risk factors that determine its persistence.
Oh, wait, let me make sure I'm grasping this. The mechanism that throws the train off the tracks initially is not the same mechanism that keeps the train stranded in the ravine.
Exactly. The lack of discrete, shared effects across both onset and persistence suggests that the longitudinal course of a psychiatric disease is not predetermined at the moment of the first psychotic break.
Wow.
It remains potentially modifiable even after the illness has taken hold. I mean, this is the entire justification for studying clinical epidemiology in the first place, to identify intervention points not just for prevention, but for altering the trajectory of chronic suffering.
That makes the stakes of this deep dive incredibly high. But before we start mapping out the specific genetic blueprints and the environmental switches, I feel like we have to address the label on the box.
Ah, yes, the diagnosis.
Yeah, because early in chapter 12.5, there's a statistic that just forced me to completely reevaluate everything I thought I knew about this topic. The text states that the total lifetime prevalence of disorders in the psychosis spectrum is 3.5%. So out of 1,000 people, 35 will experience a disorder on this spectrum.
Right, and the prevalence data is robust there. But it is the breakdown of that 3.5% that challenges the historical orthodoxy of the field.
Exactly, because less than a third of those people actually meet the strict traditional diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. Less than a third.
Yeah.
If fewer than a third of the people experiencing these profoundly disruptive psychotic symptoms actually have schizophrenia, what are clinicians actually looking at? Have we just been forcing these patients into the wrong categorizations for the last century?
I mean, undeniably, the field has spent decades forcing a highly fluid, biologically messy reality into incredibly rigid categorical boxes.
Right.
We are currently navigating a massive paradigm shift in psychiatric classification. The field is moving away from treating schizophrenia as an isolated monolithic disease entity and moving much more towards the conceptual framework of a psychosis spectrum disorder.
The hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, Hytop, refers to it as the psychosis superspectrum, doesn't it? It implies that these symptoms don't respect the borders of our standard diagnostic manuals at all.
They don't. The symptoms bleed across boundaries constantly. Clinicians routinely observe severe psychotic symptoms in bipolar disorder, in major depressive episodes with psychotic features, in substance-induced states, and, as we said, as transient developmental experiences in the general population.
Yeah.
The underlying biology simply does not care about the chapter headings in the ICD or the DSM.
It's so true. The DSM gives us this comforting illusion of engineering precision. You break an arm, the X-ray shows the fracture, you apply the cast. With mental health, we desperately wanted to point at a patient and say, you have disease A, which is completely distinct from disease B. But the data is telling us that the trains are all riding on the exact same interconnected network of tracks.
Which is why clinical characterization is rapidly replacing or augmenting the old categorical diagnoses. Instead of just handing a patient a static label, modern clinical epidemiology demands that clinicians synthesize transdiagnostic features with highly personalized contextual information.
So they have to assess the specific symptom dimensions, the clinical staging, the level of cognitive impairment, and the patient's unique environmental exposures.
Yes, all of it.
This brings us to the first major layer of Medlock Holmes' map, then. The underlying blueprints of the tracks themselves, the genetics. We have to understand how the trains are built before we can understand why they derail.
Absolutely. And the investigation of the genetic blueprint relies heavily on classical epidemiological triads: family studies, adoption studies, and twin studies. These provided the first undeniable indirect evidence that susceptibility to psychosis has this massive biological foundation.
Let's look at the family studies first. The text notes that if we examine first-degree relatives, so parents, siblings, or children, of an individual diagnosed with the psychosis spectrum disorder, their morbidity risk is somewhere between 2 and 9%.
And to place that in context, the baseline morbidity risk in the general population is roughly 0.5%.
So sharing 50% of your DNA with a proband, the affected individual, massively elevates your risk. But this is where the skeptic in me really has to push back.
Go ahead.
Families share genes, yes, but they also share the same roof, the same socioeconomic stressors, the same dietary patterns, and the exact same emotional climate.
That's true.
If a child grows up in a household disorganized by a parent's severe mental illness, how can a family study possibly prove that the increased risk is due to the genetic code rather than just the chaotic rearing environment?
It's a great question. The confounding variable of the rearing environment is the classic limitation of family studies. And it is exactly why the epidemiological field turned to adoption studies to untangle the threads of nature and nurture.
Right.
By looking at children separated from their biological parents at birth, researchers can isolate the genetic inheritance from the environmental exposure of being raised by an affected parent.
And the Danish and Finnish datasets mentioned in the chapter are the gold standard for this, aren't they?
They are. The Scandinavian countries maintain meticulous, centralized health and adoption registries, making these massive, long-term epidemiological studies possible. In the landmark Finnish adoptive family study led by Pekka Tienari researchers, identified adopted children whose biological mothers had a confirmed diagnosis of schizophrenia. These children were adopted away, usually very shortly after birth, and raised by completely different, unaffected families.
So they completely removed the environmental factor of the biological mother's illness from the equation.
They did, and when they tracked these adoptees into adulthood, their morbidity risk for developing a psychosis spectrum disorder was 5.1%.
Okay, but what was the risk for the control group? Like the adopted children whose biological mothers did not have schizophrenia?
The morbidity risk for the control adoptees was only 1.6%.
Wow. So even when you sever the environmental link, even when the child never experiences the stress of living with the biological mother's illness, the genetic shadow still falls heavily on their life. The risk is essentially tripled solely based on the inherited blueprint.
Yes. The adoption studies provide undeniable evidence of a powerful genetic component. But to truly quantify the weight of that genetic influence, we really have to look at twin studies.
Right, because twins give us that perfect comparison.
Exactly. They provide the most striking and frequently cited data in psychiatric genetics. Monozygotic, or identical twins, originate from a single fertilized egg and share 100% of their genetic sequence. Dizygotic, or fraternal twins, share on average 50% of their segregating genes, which basically makes them genetically identical to regular siblings.
Okay, and the chapter notes that the concordance rate for monozygotic twins is 50%. So if one identical twin develops a psychosis spectrum disorder, there is a 1 in 2 chance the other twin will also develop it.
Yes.
But for dizygotic twins, the concordance rate drops all the way down to 4.1%.
Exactly. And that precipitous drop in concordance between twins who share 100% of their genes versus those who share 50% allows us to calculate the heritability of the disorder. Current estimates suggest the heritability of schizophrenia is roughly 80%.
But I want to pause on that 50% concordance rate for identical twins for a second, because it feels like the pivot point for this entire deep dive.
It really is.
At first glance, a 50% concordance rate screams that genetics are the dominant force. But when you think about it critically, they share the exact same DNA. Every single base pair is identical.
Yeah.
If this disorder were a purely genetic disease dictated entirely by the sequence of DNA, like Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis, the concordance rate wouldn't be 50%. It would be 100%, wouldn't it?
Spot on. The 50% figure is the cornerstone of the modern understanding of psychosis. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that genetics are critical, but it simultaneously proves that genetics alone are entirely insufficient to cause the disease.
Wow.
The inherited blueprint does not dictate the outcome. Environmental factors, epigenetic modifications, or stochastic developmental events are strictly necessary to bridge the gap between vulnerability and clinical illness.
Going back to our Medlock Holmes metaphor, The genetics do not build a broken train. They build a train that is structurally sound, but just incredibly sensitive to the weather conditions it passes through.
Yes.
If the weather is fair, the train runs fine. If it hits a storm, the sensitive components fail.
That concept of a weather-sensitive train is highly illustrative. And the next logical question the field had to ask was, what exactly does this genetic blueprint look like? Because for a long time, researchers hoped to find the schizophrenia gene, a single specific mutation that caused the disorder.
But the genome-wide association studies, the GWAS data, completely demolished that hope, didn't it?
Utterly demolish it. GWAS technology allowed researchers to scan the entire genome of tens of thousands of individuals searching for single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, that occur more frequently in people with the disorder.
And what did they find?
They found that there is no single gene of large effect. Psychosis spectrum disorder is massively polygenic. It's driven by thousands of tiny common genetic variations, each contributing a microscopic amount of risk.
The text mentions a finding from the cross-disorder group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium that blew my mind. They mapped out these thousands of tiny genetic risks and found that about 2/3 of these genetic associations are common across schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder.
The genetic overlap is just staggering, and it extends even further outward, showing shared genetic liabilities with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and various intellectual disabilities.
Wait, ADHD and autism too?
Yeah, exactly. The old categorical boxes fall apart completely at the molecular level. These genetic variants do not code for a specific DSM diagnosis. They code for a generalized vulnerability to neurodevelopmental alteration and mental suffering.
So we are talking about a shared liability. So when researchers calculate a polygenic risk score, or PRS, for a patient, they are just adding up all those thousands of tiny genetic variants to get a single number representing that shared liability.
Right. A high polygenic risk score for schizophrenia does not strictly predict schizophrenia. It is associated with a wide variety of medical conditions, psychiatric presentations, and even subclinical personality traits in the general population. It's essentially a transdiagnostic biomarker of susceptibility.
But this brings up the most glaring contradiction in the chapter.
Oh, yes, the gap.
Yeah, the twin studies tell us that the heritability of schizophrenia is around 80%. But when we actually map the specific genome with GWS and calculate the polygenic risk score, all of those tens of thousands of identified genetic markers combined only explain about 7% of the variance on the liability scale.
The famous heritability gap. It is one of the most intensely debated mysteries in psychiatric genomics right now. We can see the massive genetic effect in the twin studies, but we cannot locate the vast majority of the responsible genes in the DNA sequence.
An 80% heritability estimate, but we only have the receipts for 7%. Where on earth is the other 73% hiding? Is it just that our GWS technology isn't powerful enough yet, or are we looking in the wrong place entirely?
Well, the gap is likely composed of several factors. GWIs primarily detects common genetic variants. It often misses rare structural variants, like copy number variants, where large chunks of DNA are actually duplicated or deleted.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the 7% figure assumes that genes act in a purely additive manner. It doesn't account for epistasis, which is complex gene-gene interaction where one variant turns another on or off, multiplying the risk exponentially. But a massive portion of that missing heritability is almost certainly hiding in the interplay between the genes and the environment.
And this brings us to a distinction that the textbook is very careful to make, and it is crucial for our mental model. We need to untangle gene-environment correlation from gene-environment interaction.
Yes, vitally important.
Because to a layperson, those sound like synonyms. But on Medlock Holmes's map, they represent entirely different physical mechanisms. Let's tackle gene-environment correlation first.
Gene-environment correlation, which is often abbreviated as RGE, occurs when an individual's genetic makeup actively influences the environments they're exposed to. The environment isn't just happening to them randomly. Their genes are altering the probability of encountering specific stressors.
How does that actually work in practice, though?
We can break it down into passive, evocative, and active correlation. Passive correlation happens because parents provide both the genes and the early rearing environment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if parents carry a high genetic loading for psychosis and anxiety, they pass those genes to the child. But they may also inadvertently create a highly stressful, disorganized home environment. The child's genes and their environment are correlated from day one.
Okay, what about evocative and active correlation? Because that implies the child is doing something to change their surroundings.
Exactly. Evocative correlation occurs when a child's genetically influenced behavior elicits specific responses from the environment. A child with a genetic vulnerability might have subtle, effective blunting or unusual social behaviors. This evokes negative reactions or rejection from peers and teachers, which then becomes an environmental stressor that exacerbates their vulnerability.
That's a tragic cycle.
It is. And then active correlation, or niche picking, is when the individual actively seeks out environments that match their genetic predispositions. A genetically anxious, socially vulnerable adolescent might actively withdraw from protective social networks, isolating themselves in an environment that allows their prodromal symptoms to flourish unchecked.
So with correlation, the genes are actively steering the train toward the rougher tracks, but gene-environment interaction, which the text also calls synergism, is fundamentally different.
Interaction, or GXE, postulates that the environment happens independently,
Right.
but the inherited genetic susceptibility factors moderate the physiological effect of that environmental exposure. The genetic blueprint dictates how much damage the environmental hit actually causes.
To use our metaphor, two identical trains hit the exact same patch of rough track at the exact same speed. But train A has a robust suspension system, a low genetic risk. It rattles a bit, the passengers are a bit uncomfortable, but it stays on the track.
Right.
Train B has a highly sensitized, fragile suspension system, a high genetic risk. It hits the exact same rough patch, the suspension shatters, and the train derails entirely.
Exactly. The environmental exposure is the match, but the genetics determine whether the brain is made of damp wood or highly volatile dynamite.
Wow.
If two individuals experience the exact same severe childhood trauma, the one with low genetic risk might develop depression or PTSD, but their system maintains reality testing. The individual with high polygenic risk processes that exact same trauma differently at a neurobiological level, and the environmental hit triggers the onset of a psychotic disorder.
This brings us to the exposome score. Because if we can calculate a polygenic risk score to measure the vulnerability of the train, can we calculate the total amount of rough track the train has hit?
Yes, the exposome score is a fascinating evolution in clinical epidemiology. It attempts to quantify the cumulative load of non-genetic environmental exposures an individual has faced over their lifespan.
So what does that include?
It incorporates obstetric complications, childhood adversity, cannabis use, and urbanicity. Studies from the large-scale EU-GEI consortium demonstrated clear empirical evidence for an additive interaction between an individual's molecular genetic risk state and their exposome score.
So if the genetics load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. It is time to look at the environmental tracks on our map. Let's move into the clinical manifestations. What are these specific environmental switches that cause a biologically vulnerable train to derail? We really need to start at the very beginning of the journey, before the child is even born, the prenatal and perinatal periods.
The neurodevelopmental hypothesis of psychosis demands that we examine the earliest stages of brain formation, and the epidemiological data reveal several surprising signals that occur in utero.
The one that initially baffled me was the season of birth. The chapter notes that being born in the winter or early spring in the northern hemisphere is a statistically significant risk factor for developing psychosis decades later.
Yes.
How can the month you are born possibly alter your psychiatric trajectory in adulthood? It sounds like astrology.
It appears nonsensical until you realize that the season of birth is almost certainly a proxy indicator for a specific biological exposure. The most prominent hypothesis is that winter birth correlates with increased maternal exposure to intrauterine viral infections like influenza during critical second trimester stages of fetal brain development.
Oh, so the mother mounts an immune response, and the resulting cascade of inflammatory cytokines crosses the placenta, subtly altering the neural pruning and connectivity of the developing fetal brain.
Exactly. It's the maternal immune activation hypothesis. It's not the virus itself attacking the fetal brain. It's the mother's immune system inadvertently causing collateral damage to the neurodevelopmental architecture.
That makes so much more sense.
Furthermore, winter birth could relate to variations in maternal nutrition, specifically vitamin D deficiency due to lack of sunlight or temperature-related metabolic stressors. Other early factors include advanced or very young paternal age, which increases the risk of de novo genetic mutations in the sperm, and low birth weight, which indicates intrauterine growth restriction.
But the perinatal factor that perfectly crystallizes the concept of gene-environment interaction for me is fetal hypoxia, a lack of oxygen during the birth process.
Yes, obstetric complications, particularly those involving hypoxia,
Mm.
have long been associated with an increased risk of schizophrenia. But clinical epidemiology requires us to look closer at the mechanism.
The textbook cites a highly specific population-based study conducted in Helsinki. They examined individuals who had suffered fetal hypoxia during birth.
Right.
And as expected, they found structural brain abnormalities in some of these individuals later in life, specifically reduced cortical gray matter and larger swollen ventricles, which are classic neuroanatomical markers often seen in psychotic disorders.
But the crucial finding wasn't that hypoxia caused brain damage.
Exactly. The crucial finding was who sustained the damage.
Spot on. The Helsinki study found that these specific structural brain abnormalities were exclusively present in patients who already carried a high genetic risk for psychotic disorders, and notably in their unaffected siblings who shared that genetic liability.
So when they looked at the control subjects, people who had suffered the exact same level of fetal hypoxia but lacked the familial genetic risk for psychosis, their brains did not show those structural abnormalities.
They didn't.
The lack of oxygen didn't just randomly carve out larger ventricles. The genetic vulnerability made the fetal brain exquisitely, dangerously sensitive to the hypoxic insult.
Exactly. The hypoxia induces oxidative stress and potential excitotoxicity. In a neurodevelopmentally robust brain, the system repairs the insult. In a brain carrying a high polygenic risk score for psychosis, the inflammatory and oxidative cascade disrupts the delicate migration of neurons and the establishment of dopaminergic pathways, leaving a permanent structural legacy that will remain dormant until adolescence.
It is the ultimate proof that environmental hits operate upon a pre-existing genetic landscape.
It truly is.
So the train survives the hypoxic bump on the tracks, but the suspension is now fundamentally weakened. The journey continues. The child grows into adolescence. And here we hit one of the most extensively researched, heavily weighted environmental switches on Medlock Holmes's board.
The urban upbringing.
Yeah.
The city living effect is one of the most robust, consistently replicated findings in the entire field of psychiatric epidemiology. Growing up in an urban environment, particularly in the global north, is associated with a twofold increase in the risk of developing a psychosis spectrum disorder compared to individuals raised in rural settings.
A twofold increase is massive for a sociological variable, and it isn't just a binary city versus country metric, is it? There is a clear dose-response relationship.
Absolutely. The data indicates a linear progression. The more urbanized the environment, the higher the population density and the larger the city, the higher the subsequent risk of psychosis, and the timing of the exposure is critical.
Yeah.
A seminal Danish registry study demonstrated that it is the cumulative exposure to urban environments during the first 15 years of life that drives the risk. Moving to a city as an adult does not confer the same risk.
So the developing brain is absorbing the environment and calibrating itself. There is a detail in the chapter regarding a mismatch risk that I found utterly fascinating.
Oh, the mismatch hypothesis reveals the true depth of developmental programming. Epidemiological data shows that individuals who are conceived and spend their fetal and early infant development in an urban area, but are subsequently moved and raised in a rural area, actually exhibit higher risks for psychosis than those who remain in the city.
That is wild. It is as if the fetal brain detects the environmental signals of the mother living in a dense, high-stress concrete jungle, and it calibrates its threat detection systems, its amygdala, its stress hormone axis, to survive in that specific environment. And when the child is then dropped into a quiet, rural setting, the highly calibrated threat detection system misfires because the environment no longer matches the biological programming. The text notes this phenomenon mirrors patterns we observe in cardiovascular disease epidemiology.
The physiological calibration is real, but we must interrogate the specific mechanism of the urban environment. What is the actual toxic exposure?
This is the vital question. If I grew up in central London or New York City, is it the physical environment making me psychotic? Is it the diesel particulate matter in the smog? Is it the noise pollution from the sirens? Is it the physical shadow of the skyscrapers?
While environmental toxins like lead and air pollution are being studied, the overwhelming weight of the epidemiological evidence suggests that the physical environment is secondary. The primary driver of the urbanicity effect is the social environment. It is about group-level sociological processes acting upon individual biology.
We are talking about social fragmentation.
Precisely. Neighborhoods characterized by high social fragmentation are the true risk zones. These are areas with high residential turnover, where people do not know their neighbors, where there is an absence of mutual trust, and where crime and material deprivation are prevalent. In these environments, the developing adolescent brain is subjected to chronic, low-level social threat and hypervigilance.
Conversely, the data shows that neighborhoods richly endowed with what sociologists term social capital, so interpersonal trust, mutual aid, a sense of collective efficacy and reciprocity, have significantly reduced rates of psychosis.
Exactly.
And this holds true entirely independent of the neighborhood's socioeconomic status. You can have a materially poor neighborhood that has deep, cohesive social capital, and the psychosis rates remain lower.
The social cohesion acts as a biological buffer against stress. This concept ties directly into another major, highly replicated finding discussed in the chapter, the phenomenon of ethnic density.
Ethnic density is described as a highly protective factor. It refers to the percentage of individuals in a specific neighborhood who share the same ethnic or cultural background. The studies consistently demonstrate that the higher the ethnic density for a minority group in an area, the lower their individual rates of developing a psychosis spectrum disorder.
Right. When a minority individual lives in an area where they are surrounded by their own ethnic group, they possess a built-in community. They are buffered against the daily microaggressions, structural discrimination, and profound social fragmentation of the wider dominant culture.
They are shielded from chronic social defeat, which leads us to navigate one of the most complex, politically sensitive, yet epidemiologically vital environmental risk factors in the text: migration and minority position.
And it's essential to approach this strictly through the lens of sociological and epidemiological data. Meta-analyses consistently show a threefold increase in the risk of developing psychosis for migrant populations compared to the native-born majority population of the host country.
And when researchers stratify that data, the risks are heavily concentrated in specific demographics. The rates are notably higher, 5 to 7-fold increases for Black Caribbean and Black African immigrants in the United Kingdom, and for Surinamese and Moroccan immigrants in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Now, a skeptical observer might look at that data and immediately suggest reverse causation. They might argue, perhaps individuals who are already carrying a high genetic liability, who are already experiencing prodromal restlessness or dissatisfaction, are the ones who self-select to uproot their lives and migrate.
The selective migration hypothesis is a necessary scientific question, but the rigorous epidemiological data heavily refutes it. The selective migration theory fundamentally fails to explain the massively elevated risk observed in populations that migrated en masse.
Right. You cannot argue that an entire population migrating simultaneously consists solely of genetically vulnerable individuals.
Furthermore, the selective migration hypothesis completely fails to account for the second-generation data. Second-generation immigrants, the children born in the host country who never undertook the physical stress of migration themselves, frequently exhibit risk rates that are equal to or even higher than the first generation.
If it is not the physical act of crossing a border, and it is not a pre-existing genetic selection, what is the mechanism? How does moving to a new country alter the neurobiology of the brain so drastically?
The ASOP study in the UK, which is a landmark investigation into first-episode psychosis, points directly to the cumulative burden of social adverse experiences. The mechanism is the sociological and psychological impact of holding a marginalized minority position over a lifespan.
The chronic experience of social defeat.
Exactly. We're looking at a lifetime of accumulated structural discrimination, insidious interpersonal racism, marginalization, lower expectations from educational systems, and complex social adversity. When an individual is chronically subjected to social defeat and exclusion, their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which controls the body's stress response, remains in a state of hyperactivation. This chronic cortisol exposure cascades into the brain and gradually sensitizes the mesolimbic dopamine system.
This is the critical bridge between sociology and neurobiology. The chronic social stress doesn't just make them sad, it physically alters the dopamine receptors in the brain, turning up the volume on the system that assigns meaning and salience to the world around them.
Is the environment pulling the trigger on the genetic liability? Yes.
And speaking of environmental triggers that interact with dopamine, we have to look at the next massive swing on the tracks: cannabis.
Yes. The debate surrounding cannabis use in mental health is ubiquitous in popular culture, but within the realm of clinical epidemiology, the data is coalescing into a very clear, albeit complex, picture.
The textbook states unequivocally that heavy cannabis users exhibit a fourfold increase in the risk of developing a psychosis spectrum disorder. Average users show a twofold increase.
The presence of a clear dose-response relationship is a strong indicator of a causal component. The data also reveals that the age of onset and the specific pharmacological makeup of the cannabis are critical variables.
So timing and potency.
Exactly. Starting use during early adolescence when the brain is undergoing massive synaptic pruning and frontal lobe development significantly amplifies the risk. Furthermore, the use of high-potency cannabis strains engineered to have very high concentrations of THC and negligible amounts of the protective antipsychotic cannabinoid CBD drives the risk up exponentially.
THC is an agonist at the CB1 receptors in the brain, which are heavily integrated with the dopamine system. So we have a biological plausibility. But I have to play devil's advocate here, because this is the classic chicken or egg epidemiological puzzle. The omitted variable bias.
Go on.
If a teenager is experiencing the very early prodromal phase of schizophrenia, they feel an inexplicable anxiety, their thoughts are racing, they feel alienated and strange, aren't they highly motivated to seek out a substance to calm their nervous system?
Right, the self-medication theory.
Yeah. How can researchers confidently claim that the cannabis is causing the psychosis rather than concluding that people with early psychosis are simply self-medicating with cannabis?
The self-medication hypothesis was the primary counter-argument for decades. Traditional observational epidemiology struggled to definitively answer it because it is virtually impossible to control for every single confounding variable in a standard study design.
Right, because everyone is so different.
Exactly. You cannot perfectly account for an individual's exact genetic loading, their precise childhood trauma history, their peer group influences, and their baseline personality traits all at once.
But the field evolved. The chapter explains that modern clinical epidemiology solved this by utilizing something called panel data.
Panel data methodologies represent a massive leap forward in establishing causal inference. Instead of taking a snapshot of different people at one point in time, panel data involves tracking the exact same individuals, taking repeated measurements in multiple intervals over a long period.
Oh, I see.
This allows researchers to conduct what is known as a within-person analysis, rather than a between-person analysis.
The textbook provides an incredibly clarifying analogy for this using physical exercise and heart rate. If you conduct a between-person analysis, meaning you compare a large group of different people, you will generally find that individuals who exercise frequently have a lower resting heart rate than people who do not exercise.
Right, and the between-person conclusion would be that exercise is associated with a lower heart rate because fitter individuals have stronger cardiovascular systems.
But if you take just one person and you measure their heart rate while they're sitting on the sofa, and then you measure that exact same person's heart rate while they are sprinting on a treadmill, you get a completely different result. The within-person analysis proves that the act of exercising causes the heart rate to increase dramatically.
Yes.
The relationship completely reverses depending on the analytical model.
The brilliance of the within-person panel data model is that the individual acts as their own perfect control. Because you are measuring the same person over time, all of their fixed, unmeasured traits, their exact DNA sequence, their early childhood trauma, their baseline temperament, are automatically held constant. The only variable that changes is time and exposure to the substance.
And when researchers applied this strict within-person panel data analysis to the question of cannabis and psychosis, what happened to the self-medication hypothesis?
The major longitudinal studies found robust evidence that the initiation and frequency of cannabis use temporally preceded and provoked the subsequent exacerbation of psychotic symptoms. When the exact same individual increased their cannabis use, their psychotic symptoms worsened in the following time period.
Wow.
The data strongly supported the causal component hypothesis and did not support the self-medication hypothesis.
So, to integrate this into Medlock Holmes's map, cannabis is not a universal poison that will derail every single train on the network. But if a train is already carrying a heavy polygenic load and its suspension has already been weakened by childhood adversity or urban social fragmentation, pouring high-potency THC into the engine is an incredibly effective way to force a derailment.
That's a great way to put it. Cannabis is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause a psychosis spectrum disorder on its own in the general population. However, in biologically vulnerable individuals, it acts as a significant, heavily weighted component cause that can push the system over the threshold into clinical illness.
We have mapped the genetic blueprints, and we have identified the major environmental switches: hypoxia, open fragmentation, migration stress, and cannabis. But a train doesn't usually derail instantly without making some terrible noises first, does it?
Rarely.
Before the full clinical explosion of a first episode psychosis occurs, can we see the warning signs on the tracks?
Clinical epidemiologists refer to these early warning signs as pre-morbid vulnerability indicators. And the data shows they manifest significantly earlier in the lifespan than the general public or even many clinicians realize.
The textbook points to subtle, early neurodevelopmental abnormalities, things like delays in reaching standard motor milestones. We're talking about delays in walking or standing unsupported. And these motor delays are statistically most conspicuous before the child even reaches the age of 2.
It is a profound observation. It confirms that the trajectory toward a psychosis spectrum disorder is firmly rooted in early neurodevelopmental alteration. The biological blueprint is expressing itself in subtle neuromotor deficits years before any psychiatric symptoms emerge.
And the indicators progress as the child ages. Receptive language deficits, difficulties in understanding spoken language, become prominent between the ages of 5 and 15. Furthermore, there is a measurable divergence in cognitive development.
Yes, the IQ data is very telling.
Children who eventually develop a psychosis spectrum disorder frequently exhibit lower IQ scores compared to their own unaffected siblings, and this intelligence gap noticeably widens between the ages of 4 and 7.
It is crucial to emphasize that a delay in walking or a slightly lower IQ score does not cause psychosis. They are epiphenomena. They are the subtle, observable ripples on the surface that indicate the underlying genetic liability is quietly altering the deep neurodevelopmental architecture of the brain.
This all paints a picture of a remarkably long, incredibly complex journey. The vulnerabilities are seeded before birth, the switches are flipped throughout childhood and adolescence, and the warning signs flash for decades.
It is a lifelong process.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most clinically important major section of our deep dive: integration and clinical reasoning. Once the train actually derails, once the psychosis fully manifests and the patient arrives at the clinic, what happens next? What is the actual trajectory of the illness?
To answer that, the field of clinical epidemiology has had to actively and aggressively dismantle a century of deeply entrenched prognostic pessimism.
Prognostic pessimism is the perfect term for it. Culturally, and even within the medical profession, a diagnosis of schizophrenia has long been viewed as a death sentence for the mind. It is assumed to be a one-way ticket to permanent, unremitting deterioration and institutionalization.
That uniformly bleak perspective has dominated psychiatry since the late 19th century. It originated with Emil Kraepelin, the foundational German psychiatrist who originally conceptualized dementia praecox, which later evolved into the diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Right.
Kraepelin categorically defined the illness by its deteriorating longitudinal course. He believed that if you did not deteriorate, you did not have the disease.
But the textbook highlights a massive foundational flaw in Kraepelin's observational data: a statistical trap known as Bergson's bias.
Bergson's bias, often referred to as hospital bias or admission rate bias, occurs when a researcher studies a disease exclusively within a highly specific clinical setting rather than in the general population. Kraepelin formulated his theories while observing patients in massive custodial state asylums.
He was entirely focused on the trains that had crashed spectacularly at the bottom of the ravine, caught fire, and could not be recovered, because those were the only trains in the asylum.
Exactly.
He completely missed all the trains that derailed slightly, received some help in the community, got back on the tracks, and went back to work. He assumed the catastrophic outcome was the only outcome.
His sample was entirely skewed toward the most severe, highly complex, and most socially debilitating cases that required long-term institutional care. Modern clinical epidemiology, using population-based cohorts, provides a radically different, vastly more accurate, and much more optimistic picture of the longitudinal course.
Let's look at the modern data then. The ASOC cohort study in the UK tracked first episode psychosis patients over a 10-year period. When they used advanced statistical modeling to map out the long-term trajectories, what did they actually find?
The ESOP data reveal that over 58% of the patients followed a remitting, improving course over the decade.
Wow.
They experienced episodes, but they also experienced significant periods of recovery and improvement. Another 11% exhibited late improvements or late declines. Only approximately 30% of the cohort demonstrated the classic Kraepelinian course of persistent, continuous, unremitting illness.
Nearly 60% of individuals experience a remitting and improving trajectory. That completely shatters the myth of inevitable, permanent deterioration.
It forces clinicians to abandon therapeutic nihilism. However, the epidemiological data also demands that we listen to the patients themselves regarding how we define a good outcome.
Yes, there's a fascinating study from Italy about this, isn't there?
Yes, a study from Italy compared objective clinical indicators of recovery with subjective patient-reported outcomes.
This part of the chapter is a gut punch to standard psychiatric practice. The clinicians define a good outcome as symptom reduction. Are the hallucinations gone? Are the delusions suppressed? Excellent, the treatment is working. But what are the patients focused on?
The patients reported that their persistent, unmet social and existential needs caused them vastly more distress and functional disability than the clinical symptoms themselves.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. The sheer terror of the hallucinations was often secondary to the devastating loss of social connection. The patients were struggling to find meaning in their lives, to maintain intimate relationships, to secure employment, and to recover a sense of perspective and self-worth after the trauma of a psychotic break.
And yet, modern psychiatric services are almost entirely geared toward pharmacology. The system provides a dopamine antagonist to suppress the voices, but it offers very little structural support to help the patient rebuild a shattered life. If the clinical epidemiology tells us that unmet social needs drive long-term disability, then functional, social, and psychological interventions must be prioritized just as highly as the medication.
It reveals a profound gap in the current care model. We are treating the biological mechanism of the derailment, but we are leaving the passenger stranded in the wilderness.
To improve our interventions, we need to understand how the derailment actually happens in real time. If a clinician is running a clinic and trying to predict which troubled teenager is going to transition into full-blown psychosis, what should they look for? Because the chapter offers a sharp critique of the popular ultra-high-risk clinic model.
For the past 2 decades, the field has invested heavily in identifying youth who exhibit attenuated or subthreshold psychotic symptoms.
So, early warning signs.
Right. A teenager might report hearing occasional whispers when no one is there, or harboring mild, fleeting paranoid thoughts. The clinical assumption was that these subtle symptoms would linearly intensify. The whispers would become commanding voices. The mild paranoia would harden into fixed delusions. This assumes a homotypic progression.
Homotypic meaning psychosis simply breeds more severe psychosis. It stays within the same symptom family. But the population-level data contradicts this neat linear model, doesn't it?
It does. General population studies consistently demonstrate that the development of clinical psychosis is predominantly a heterotypic progression.
Heterotypic meaning it changes form entirely. The train jumps from one type of track to a completely different one.
Exactly. The emergence of a full psychotic disorder rarely arises from isolated, quietly intensifying psychotic symptoms. It almost always emerges from a chaotic background of severe, non-psychotic psychopathology.
What does that look like?
The prodromal phase is characterized by crushing anxiety, deep depressive episodes, severe affective dysregulation, and often substance use. These non-psychotic issues synergize with transient subclinical psychotic symptoms. The psychosis is not an isolated specific track. Rather, it is an indicator of the escalating severity of a highly mixed, transdiagnostic state of mental suffering.
We have covered an immense landscape today. We have examined polygenic risk, fetal hypoxia, the mismatch of urbanicity, the chronic stress of migration, the accelerant of high-potency cannabis, and the heterotypic progression of the illness.
It's a lot of ground.
If I am a clinician, a trainee, or a motivated learner trying to build a unified, functional mental model of all this data, how do I tie every single thread together?
The authors of the chapter provide an elegant synthesis known as the Psychosis Proneness Persistence Impairment Model. It is visually represented in figure 12.5-2, and it serves as the ultimate map of Medlock Holmes's railway network.
Okay, let's unpack that.
To understand it, we can walk through the trajectories of 3 hypothetical individuals, person A, person B, and person C.
Let's trace their routes. We start with the baseline statistic that shocked me earlier. Roughly 15% of children in the general population experience some form of transient, attenuated psychotic symptom during their development.
It is a critical starting point. These transient symptoms are a natural, albeit distressing, expression of the shared genetic liability distributed across the human population. They are a feature of neurodevelopment, not necessarily a disease.
So person A experiences this proneness. They have a subclinical psychotic experience. But person A has a robust genetic suspension system and a protective environment. They live in a cohesive neighborhood with high social capital, they have a secure attachment, and they do not experience severe trauma.
Right.
Because they do not hit any major environmental switches, the symptoms remain transient. The brain regulates itself, the symptoms fade away entirely, and person A continues on a smooth developmental trajectory.
Exactly. Now consider person B. Person B shares that exact same baseline proneness. However, person B's journey involves exposure to mild or moderate environmental hits. They might grow up in a moderately fragmented urban environment, experience significant social defeat at school, or begin using cannabis during early adolescence.
Because of those environmental hits acting upon their baseline vulnerability, their psychotic symptoms do not fade away. They become persistent. The train doesn't completely derail, but it is rattling violently. They might struggle with long-term, low-grade perceptual anomalies, chronic paranoia, and moderate functional impairment, but they may never fully cross the threshold into a severe, acute psychotic break.
Spot on. And finally, we observe person C. Person C carries a severe polygenic liability. Their neurodevelopmental suspension is highly fragile, and their journey involves heavy, repeated, and compounding environmental hits.
So the synergistic effect we talked about earlier.
Yes, they endure severe childhood trauma. They experience the chronic, grinding HPA axis activation of social marginalization, and they self-medicate with high-potency cannabis.
The compounding environmental exposures act synergistically upon their genetic risk. The trauma and the social defeat epigenetically sensitize their mesolimbic dopamine system. The cannabis floods that sensitized system.
This system gets overwhelmed.
The brain's signal-to-noise ratio completely collapses. They can no longer distinguish the salient signals of external reality from the chaotic noise generated by their own internal neural networks. Person C crosses the threshold from persistence into full impairment. The train derails. The clinical psychotic disorder manifests.
It is a lifelong, dynamic conversation between the DNA and the environment. The genetic susceptibility factors interact with the cumulative environmental exposures to fundamentally alter brain neurobiology over the life course.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's crystallize the overarching journey. We began by realizing that psychosis is not a rigid, inescapable categorical box inherited purely through simple Mendelian genetics.
Far from it.
It is a transdiagnostic superspectrum disorder. It is born from an incredibly complex, lifelong interplay between a shared polygenetic vulnerability and a vast array of environmental, obstetric, and sociological exposures.
The ultimate lesson of clinical epidemiology, and the reason it is the foundational science of preventive psychiatry, is that destiny is not written in the DNA.
I love that phrase.
The longitudinal course of this spectrum is highly modifiable. Environmental risk factors like the trauma of social fragmentation, chronic social defeat, and early cannabis use are necessary complementary components required for the disorder to fully manifest. By mapping the network, we identify the exact points where we can intervene, repair the tracks, and change the trajectory of a human life.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you digest this chapter. If we accept the epidemiological data that mild psychotic experiences are a natural, transient developmental phase for up to 15% of the population, and that these experiences only solidify into a debilitating lifelong illness under the crushing weight of environmental stress, trauma, and social fragmentation.
Yes, the logical conclusion is profound.
Exactly. How much of what we label as severe mental illness is actually just a normal human brain working exactly as designed, desperately trying to survive and adapt to an abnormal, deeply fractured society?
That is the defining question that should guide not only future research, but the daily clinical practice of every psychiatrist.
To help lock in all the critical mechanisms and concepts we've explored today, let's do some active learning reinforcement. I am going to ask 6 single best answer questions based directly on the material. I will pause briefly after asking the question, so try to formulate the answer in your head before we provide the solution.
Let's test the integrity of that mental model.
Question 1. What historical epidemiological phenomenon explains why Emil Kraepelin originally characterized dementia praecox, the precursor to schizophrenia, as a uniformly deteriorating condition with an overwhelmingly dismal prognosis?
That would be Bergson's bias, which is also known as hospital admission rate bias. Kraepelin based his foundational theories on a highly skewed sample by studying only the most severe chronic cases requiring long-term institutionalization in state asylums. entirely missing the large population of individuals who experienced psychotic episodes but recovered in the community.
Question 2, true or false? Modern genome-wide association studies, or GWS, demonstrate that the thousands of genetic variants predisposing an individual to schizophrenia are entirely distinct and separate from the genetic variants predisposing someone to bipolar disorder.
False. The genetic architecture is characterized by massive polygenic overlap. Approximately two-thirds of the genetic associations identified are common across schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder, indicating a transdiagnostic shared liability rather than disease-specific genes.
Question 3. Which specific environmental risk factor has been shown to have a critical developmental exposure window concentrated during the first 15 years of life, displaying a clear linear dose-response relationship with the subsequent risk of developing a psychosis spectrum disorder?
Urban upbringing, or the effect of urbanicity. The cumulative exposure to the social fragmentation and chronic stress of an urban environment during early brain development significantly amplifies the risk.
Question 4. In the context of premorbid vulnerability indicators, at what developmental stage are abnormalities in basic motor milestones, such as delays in walking or standing unsupported, most conspicuous in children who subsequently develop a psychosis spectrum disorder later in life?
Before the age of 2. This highlights that the neurodevelopmental trajectory is already being subtly altered by the genetic liability in infancy, years before the onset of psychiatric symptoms.
Question 5. Does population-based epidemiological data suggest that the onset of clinical psychosis is primarily driven by a homotypic progression, meaning subclinical psychotic symptoms simply escalate into clinical psychotic symptoms, or a heterotypic progression?
It is predominantly a heterotypic progression. Full clinical psychosis typically emerges from a highly mixed background of non-psychotic psychopathology, such as severe anxiety, deep depression, and affective dysregulation, which synergizes with transient subclinical psychotic symptoms.
Question 6, our final question. What specific term is used to describe the neighborhood-level sociological phenomenon that significantly lowers the risk of developing psychosis for minority populations when they reside in areas with a high percentage of individuals from their own ethnic or cultural background?
Ethnic density. High ethnic density acts as a powerful biological and psychological buffer by providing social capital, fostering cohesion, and reducing the chronic HPA axis activation caused by social fragmentation and social defeat.
We strongly encourage you to return to Chapter 12.5 in Kaplan and Sadock's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry to review the specific odds ratios, study methodologies, and complex statistical models in even greater depth. Here are the details of this episode.
The Clinical Epidemiology of Psychosis Spectrum Disorder. Byline. Psychosis rarely appears from nowhere. It emerges from a long and changing conversation between vulnerability, development adversity, and the environments through which a person travels.